Thank you everyone for coming to our first recording of a podcast talking about students' voice. Um, just to start, if you can briefly introduce yourselves and yeah, tell us about what you're studying or working on and what's your connection with LSE.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So my name is Jillian Ducker. I'm an alumni at the school, so last year I did my master's in media and communications and the gender department. And I now work at LSE doing student community work. I was a Changemaker Scholar last year and a class representative, so that's sort of where I link up with all of the student voice work.
Thank you.
My name is Onifade. I'm currently the Welfare and Liberation Sabbatical Officer in the SU, so that kind of links into my big tie, link into LSE, but I'm also in the International Relations Department and I love it there.
That's good. I'm Serena Popat. I am a part-time master's student. I'm studying behavioural science. I also did my undergrad at LSE several years ago in maths and economics. And I participate in the student education panel, and I'm also an LSE content creator.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to start the conversation around student voice, I wanted to ask you about your positionality and how do you think that has influenced the different roles that you've taken during your studies to take on student voice as one of the activities that you do on top of your studies.
I don't mind starting. Yeah. So for me, I would say something that definitely rings into mind, despite, maybe, being a black woman, I would say definitely my socio-economic status has played a role in terms of where I am today. So that enabled me, first of all, to live in halls, which I think is a massive part of if you feel connected to LSE in general, or in terms of having visibility on campus. I feel like commuting makes your life so much harder, and it makes practical things like being part of any student voice activity just practically harder, and I think that takes away all of the incentives. So I think halls definitely played a big role, and especially because we live in London where rent, the amount of money we pay for halls is higher than our actual tuition cost, which I think is completely obscene when you put it into the general state of higher education, where in many places in the UK it's not like that. And I would say that enabled me to feel a sense of belonging and community that I might have not felt otherwise, because I had my department, but I think in terms of living in halls and then being part of a sports club or a society, which I was as part of ACS and Taekwondo, where the training is 4 times a week, I think it gives you like a fast track into knowing what the experiences are outside of your course, or just generally feeling more connected to LSE as LSE, not just your department. So I think that's definitely something upon reflection I thought about in terms of being able to live in halls and being able to partake in extracurricular activities, how that's made me feel a greater sense of embeddedness within the LSE community, which has practically made getting involved very easy in terms of I lived closer to campus, and then in terms of incentive, I felt as if I had a bigger stake in this community and I wanted to implement change.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that you got so involved sort of through your other community experiences at LSE, because for me, my involvement here actually felt sort of quite the opposite, where I came in feeling quite disconnected from London and from the LSE community in general, but I was really passionate about sort of student government. So I'd been in some form of student government since I was, I think 11 was the first time I was in a student council back in my middle school. And so I knew when I arrived that I wanted to be part of some sort of representative structure on campus. And it was actually through becoming a class rep that I felt I actually became really passionate about student community and was able to help build a community amongst my program. But it was only sort of through that representative position that all came about. So I think that's a really interesting in.
Another thing I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned was the bit you talked about commuting, which is super interesting. So whilst I'm doing this master's, I'm actually commuting from home, and it's quite a long commute. It's like an hour and a half each way, door to door, which takes up a lot of time, definitely. And I completely agree with undergraduates living out. Like, I think you definitely can get involved in university and there's so many options for you. But doing my undergrad, I lived out all 3 years, had the best time. But then when deciding to do the masters, I knew I wanted to live at home to save money. And I think part of that is I also wanted to, I knew about all of the different experiences available to me. And so I don't, even though I have a long commute, I just plan my time more to ensure that I'm still able to get involved in all of those different things to share my voice, because I think commuting is, you know, part of London life. Everyone will have to at some point. And so it's important to ensure that even those who do commute and have slightly different experiences are able to share their voice in different ways and make sure that those opportunities are accessible for them.
Yeah, I think breaking down, like, there's definitely, as you mentioned, like a hidden cost to participating in LSE life in general that maybe isn't really discussed or isn't given the visibility that is needed. Because as you said, like, you completely were astute, like you have the skills to be like, okay, I'm going to plan ahead because I want to be part of this community. But maybe other students, it could be like a myriad of reasons, like lack of experience or just like cultural capital in which they don't really have, we haven't empowered them, not necessarily don't have, but we haven't empowered them enough to think about these different options or what they could do. So I think like definitely a more critical understanding of what is this hidden cost to, you know, hashtag being part of LSE that we maybe don't think about that other students are experiencing, just to, as everyone says, level up the playing field. But I think, of course, to empower students to have autonomy and agency over their own LSE experience, because I think that's something that like higher socio-economic status gives a lot of students in terms of like, I could do what I want really, I don't have the practical barriers of thinking about, oh, when's the last train, because I walk home. So I think, that's definitely, just picking up from what you said, that definitely resonates.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of sort of those hidden barriers, right, it also comes down to your background and things like race. You know, I grew up as a white woman. I've always felt very empowered to use my voice. Not everyone has that, so how can we provide the training and the encouragement to say, you know, no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, we'll listen to you and we'll actually provide you all of the training you need, right, to be able to become someone who can, you know, confidently represent themselves and what they need to get out into the community.
Yeah, I think like just adding from what you said, I think maybe a reluctancy from organisation comes from a deficit model, which I understand. But for me, I've always believed that, you know, people have different needs. Like we have to address things with an equity concern. And I think in terms of, doesn't that empower us more as like people who can implement change, to think about ways that we can do things to empower students? And this is just something from someone from the European Institute said that really resonated with me, that it's not about students are lucky to be there, it's like we're lucky to have them. And I feel that just struck a chord in terms of like, what more can we do to make students feel as if like we're grateful for their presence, for them to be part of this community with us, to learn and share and, you know, to understand the causes of things for the betterment of society. So it's like, that's something I don't know has given me a bit of hope in terms of, if we look at things from that macro level of making, what can we do to make students feel as if we're lucky, we're grateful that they chose LSE, and how that can lead to actions in the future in terms of to deal with those hidden barriers.
That's actually super interesting that you mentioned that, because just before we were talking about why student voice is important, and I think there's a shift from students paying for one set service, and also like in the wider world as well with like consumption of products and other services, but like students aren't just paying for one service, they're expecting so much more from it and want to be involved in the development of it to make sure it remains current, is you know, ensuring that they're developing the right skills for their future and whatever they go on to. So I think that's a really important point around why student voice is so important.
Yeah, definitely.
And thinking about like what came up about the costs and sort of like challenges and perhaps personal motivations to, because all of you have participated in instances where you have taken time of your studies to dedicate to voice student challenges or interests or anything related to students' experience. So perhaps looking into your motivations to participate and how that relates to, it has to do with personal stories, with I don't know, your trajectory in education, if you, because we have a undergraduate, postgraduate, and current worker.
Alumni. Also
Alumni. Yeah, so how then, because you participated in different stages in your life, so where does that motivation comes from, considering the costs that are associated to participate and the retribution that you get from those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for me personally. One of the reasons I've always sort of been so active in student government at different points in my life is because I'm quite passionate about education and what education can be, and sort of making sure in the student experience that we're providing sort of multiple outlets for learning. So you're not just learning in the classroom, right? But you're also learning outside of the classroom, whether that be academic knowledge or soft skills that you're going to take forward in life. So that's a passion that's always really guided me. And I think, again, I've always been aware of my positionality and the fact that I have these privileges, right, where people tend to listen to me when I speak, whether they want to or not. So I've always been aware of the role I can play in amplifying voices that aren't being heard or aren't being overlooked. So that's also always been a big motivation for me and something I thought quite carefully about at LSE as a changemaker scholar and as a class rep, because I was working with really international and diverse cohorts.
I'd say for me, like, to bog it down and to articulate it, like, I've always felt connected to LSE on a macro level, which I think is quite hard in terms of, like, I love my department, like, I love international relations, but there was also other things that I took part that made me feel this sense of, like, LSE and learning. And I think for me it stems back to the clubs and societies I was part of, in terms I would talk to my friends and hear what's happening in econ or what's happening in PBS, that they get to do a podcast for summative, and I was like, how lovely, like, amazing. And I think that just in terms of, like, because I was so aware of what was going on in different departments, it was almost as if I felt that sense of, like, LSE as LSE, not just as being an IR student, which I think has been critical in terms of me engaging with different issues. And then I think in terms of positionality as well, like, being black on campus, there's not that many of us. So the black people, the cohort of black students in my year, we already have our own community, which I think has allowed us to, again, see things from a macro level, not just the department level as well. And in terms of, I think it links to my main motivation for, I think the main thing that enabled me to run for the role that I have now is because lots of people saw it in me. And those people who were like, oh, Sarah, you should run, they weren't necessarily from my department. There were people that I was, connected with through a club or society, or just, like, in terms of, like, ethnic group, or just, like, social relations, in terms of, I think what really helped me was the fact that so many people from different aspects of LSE thought, Sarah should do this, you'll be a good candidate. So I think that made me feel a holistic support from LSE as a whole, rather than, my department, people from my department think I might be good for this role, let me just do it, but I don't want to know what other people are thinking as well. So I think that's been a key thing for me on why I felt comfortable enough to run, because it is quite hard, you have to put yourself out there. And then another key thing again is that I had, like, in terms of, like, even friendships, I had people helping me run my campaign that weren't even in my department. Like, one of my best friends is in law, another one is in social policy, another one in, like, econ. So I think in terms of that kind of shows, like, how important it is to foster a connection outside of your department, and how that can make a student feel LSE on a macro level.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And I think, in a way, when I did my undergrad here, I didn't make the most of that, and I think that's part of the reason why, when deciding where to do my master's, as much as I love the programme, I also wanted to come back to LSE and make the most of, like, all the opportunities available here. And having worked for, like, 4 to 5 years, I have so much wider experience of, like, the world out there and how university does shape that I wanted to make sure I fed all of that back into, like, LSE, so that it can prepare people better for what's next when they leave higher education. And I think what I found really interesting is, on my master's course, I think like 95% are international, which to me is, like, so cool. It's so great to learn from other people's experiences and, what their education systems are like. And I just found that we ended up speaking about all different types of things about how they've grown up, what sorts of things they've had to do. And so capturing all of that information and being able to feed it back in, where some other people aren't as interested in feeding that information back, is super important. And actually it's really exciting to be able to contribute to developing like the institution and education.
And yeah, on that note, I wanted to ask you about what do you see as the current channels of communication between students and the LSE, more like the institutional part of it, that you have taken part of or that you know that are available? Yeah, sort of like a state of the art on what LSE offers.
Yeah, they had like termly leadership Q&As,
Mm-hmm.
and now they've kind of morphed that, like it's quite very like circular narrative in terms of I used to like participate in those Q&As in terms of like just asking questions, and now I'm part of the panel on the other side. And like one thing that I do really welcome is the fact that they've made it more broad to include different people in leadership positions from PSL and different avenues of LSE. It's not just the Vice Chancellor, and it's not just the Vice Chancellor involved, it's also, you know, people from careers or people from wellbeing and other aspects of student life that also matter. So I think that's quite good. So I think in terms of it's like, and you know, you can talk more about change makers, but I think there's so many different avenues, but there is an issue in terms of, you know, as we talked about the hidden cost in the student, for example, like maybe a student has to travel into campus to attend that leadership event. Maybe, you know, that's something they can't do because of part-time work. So I think also we have to be critical in, as much as we have the variety and different aspects of ways students can get involved, to think about, does this privilege a certain type of student to take involved, and what students can't do these type of things, and then how can we work out mechanisms to support them?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because speaking to sort of the different feedback mechanisms I've been a part of, Changemakers was sort of the only paid or remunerated opportunity that I had to share student voice. And for me, that was really important, because I wasn't in a position to be able to take on that work without sort of some sort of payment, because I was trying to live in London, right? Which is always fun on its own. But the class rep work that I did, which is sitting on SSLC's student staff liaison consultation meetings, that's all unpaid, collecting feedback from students through, you know, surveys, focus groups, people coming to you with specific issues that you're helping to take forward. That's all unpaid work. And I think that presents a huge barrier to access then, because not everyone can take on that role, and then you are getting only certain voices that are being represented. And I also think too, thinking about how we vary between surveys and collecting in-person feedback is also really important, because I found in a lot of the formats that I've taken part in, when it comes to qualitative feedback, most of that is collected in person, because it's really hard to sort through sort of large swaths of qualitative survey data. But what that means is quieter students aren't being given the opportunity to give qualitative feedback, because they're not probably going to be comfortable to come to those in-person events, to go to big Q&As, right? Because that's quite a scary thing. So I think it's also worth thinking about how we diversify the feedback we're collecting, the types of feedback we're collecting, and the ways we're collecting it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point as well. In terms of another opportunity aside from Changemakers is the Student Education Panel, where there are like 5 meetings across the academic year on a variety of topics, and then individuals give their input. What I found really interesting in these meetings is that it really is a really wide variety of students, and even within the meetings themselves, we're often like split up into smaller groups. And again, I think even within that, it is great that there is some element of like facilitation involved to bring it out those quieter voices, where otherwise people who are louder might just end up speaking the most. So I think you know, the team that run that do a really good job of ensuring that everyone's voice is heard. But I think even within the subgroups, we as individuals also have a role to play in making sure people feel comfortable to share what they're thinking, rather than being drowned out by the loudest voice.
And what are your thoughts on the current surveys that are run at the moment to voice student concerns and opinions, and maybe ratings on different aspects of the services that the university is providing?
I think that there's definitely, in all things, there's always a balance of what is logistically easier and then what, of course, we're never going to get completely accurate data, but, and then how do we improve the accuracy of data? And I would say in terms of like the levels of that scale, maybe it's a bit high in what logistically is easier than rather than what is accurate. And then just to like what you said in terms of when we do surveys, I think there's an element of maybe you might mistakenly transpose a belief of what a student might care about or something onto them and then not allow students to really inform what they want to inform us about. So I think there is an element of, as a university or, you know, even different higher educational bodies in terms of what more can we do more to push the limits of our capacity and what we can logistically do to increase the chances of us getting relevant and more accurate data from students. Because I think something like surveys, in terms of there might be a question that you haven't thought to ask that a student may, I don't know, because, you know, this is like we're working in the realm of theoreticals, but there could just possibly be something that maybe you haven't been able to capture, or maybe a student really feels passionate about that we haven't even thought about it at all. If we're focusing so much on the effects of AI, maybe there's, you know, something that there's a group of students who share a characteristic in which their concern isn't really AI, but it's also something else. So I think there is an element of how do we cater to those needs, and of course we won't get it perfect, but I think we definitely need the space to critically engage with those type of questions and answers, because how else can we improve the experience for everyone on campus unless we're doing mechanisms and we're creating feedback mechanisms that at least try our best to cater to everyone in the first hand.
Yeah, and I think, again, not to sort of keep harping on the same qualitative data point, but I think when it comes to surveys, especially the big ones, for sort of quite clear and relevant logistical issues, we tend to try to quantify as much as possible about the student experience. But that only tells us so much. So we know then we can identify a problem, right? But we can't necessarily identify the specificity of the problem or what students want to see done about it. And I think that last bit in particular of letting students have the space to be able to suggest solutions is really important, because then we can start digging into, okay, so what do students actually want to see to fix this issue? And then that can be taken forward and the logistics of it and everything can be discussed, you know? I'm not saying we just take every solution wholesale, but I think that's a really important outlet for students. And I think it's difficult to do with surveys, but I think it would be an important step to maybe consider for future development.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think a really interesting thing about the surveys is the timing of them. I know for me anyway, in my last term, we got sent the survey link and it was at the point where we were all heads down and writing our summative essays, and so at that point we're just not thinking about a survey, and even if we then do respond, we're probably not actually going to spend time properly reflecting on perhaps how things could actually be improved, because we don't necessarily have the headspace at that point in time. So I think timing is a really key element as well to ensure you're getting like rich data that you can actually use. And then to your point, how do you then follow up with that to understand it at a more granular, deeper level, like the root cause of the problem or exactly solutions that people think would help improve it.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to kind of like, because there is it's mandatory to do the surveys, and thinking about your experiences answering it, like, and what has been discussed as survey fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see value in the surveys that you have answered, and have you seen the results, or like going back to the idea of the closing that communication loop or evaluation loop or feedback loop? What are your experiences as students with the current surveys that are run in the school? Undergraduate, postgraduate, and alumni.
I was going to say, I feel a bit privileged because having come back as a staff member, I've been able to see some of the things departments have done with the feedback given, whether it be through sort of course surveys or sort of my own class rep work. I know that changes have been made, but that's because I am the type of student that followed up with the department when I, saw my professors next to see, what's going on this year, right? But if you're not a student who's making that effort to follow up, I never would have known what would happen, what had happened with that feedback. So I think thinking about how we can report back to students after the fact, about what's being done with this data, even if it's, we can't take this forward right now for X, Y, and Z reason. It's really important because otherwise, again, I think it really worsens the survey fatigue because you have no idea what's happening with this information that you're giving out.
Yeah, I would say there definitely is a lack of acknowledgement of the data that you give to your department in general that I feel like maybe a lot of us have experienced. And I think something simple as just saying, like doing a matrix of like what is changing in our department, what is going to stay the same, but we consider then what's not going to in terms of utilising, at least, because I think for me, like a key thing just in general in terms of, I think acknowledgement and validation means a lot, even if things won't change in terms of you've heard me and you understand and you're letting me, in terms of you're giving me dignity by explaining, or you're treating me with dignity by explaining why certain things that maybe I want might not be able to happen. Because even being in this role, you learn about reforecasting and financial budgets and people doing August and things. And if I was a student and I understood that side of things more if I understood or someone explained it to me, I might have had more appreciation or compassion about why certain projects can't happen at this time of the year because they're doing their reforecasting and all of that stuff. So I think what is really important, as you said, is making sure that at least it's actioned of something, even in terms of like agenda, you approve a note and all of that stuff of like just giving validation to the contributions that students have taken the time to give you, and just to letting them know, okay, to treat them with dignity and to treat them as if they're on your level as well in terms of, you said this, okay, maybe this is why X, Y, and Z can't happen, but we appreciate you taking the time to tell us your concerns.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to having some level of transparency when it comes to departments and even the university as a whole as to how departments are structured, how the school is structured, how decision-making processes work, right? I think there's a lack of knowledge in the general student populace about how all these things are done. So it all does feel then quite amorphous.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing I was just going to mention was, I also think there's a distinction between undergrads giving feedback and 1 year master students giving feedback, where undergrads, you can probably see the changes in the next year or the year after, but for 1 year master students, I think there's an element of, okay, well, I'm here for a year, I may not give feedback, it's not going to impact me, but then also if I do give feedback, I don't know if they're going to do anything with it. But like, I have an example from my department where I'm good friends with another part-time student who's actually in their second year, and so she shared that for one of the courses they were changing how they were doing the assessment because of feedback that she and her peers provided that year, which then did change how it was done this year. And I think that is actually a really quite quick turnaround based on feedback that was given, but it wasn't necessarily communicated from like the professors or like faculty in the department that was what caused the shift. It was because she mentioned it. And so I think even just saying this is feedback we got from last, or it might have been, I can't remember exactly, but like, this is feedback we got from last year, just to show that actually giving feedback is valuable. I think that's a really nice way of doing it, because it is really important to get feedback from people to improve, because otherwise everything will just stay the same.
Yeah, and I know some departments have actioned, I think, some similar things. I can't remember who I was talking to, I think they were from sociology, but they have like a You Asked We Did sort of newsletter that goes out after their SSLC meetings, where it sort of is just a report of, this is what was raised, these are our plans, or what we can do around these points, which I think is a really nice sort of simple way to feed that information back to students.
And I actually just thought of another example based off what you said earlier around students not necessarily understanding the construct of like the institution departments and how things work. So there was a group of us that had a meeting with our academic mentor, and we were actually giving him some feedback on the course that he runs, And actually several of the changes were structural changes about like timings and things like that. And he then explained how, I think it's like 2 years or 3 years you have to wait in order for any structural changes to be made. And so for us, it seems like a very easy thing to change, or why can't you do it? It's just a room booking. But actually, like, we're forgetting there's several other departments, thousands of other students to all timetable for. So I think even just, like what you said about being transparent around, we can try to make changes in these areas, but these are the current limitations we're facing in this area. It's still useful to give feedback, but nothing will really happen until X or something like that, just to give some context. Because I think otherwise everyone's giving this feedback, but again, it's like, okay, well, it's not going to change, so I'm not going to give any more.
I was thinking about the challenge of feedback for postgraduate students, and if you communicate from one year to the next, probably the challenges that you will face won't be that different to the ones that the previous generation had. So kind of like, how do you construct in a more with more solidarity to your next generation, so then you feel appreciated because someone did it before you, and then you give that back at the end of your year.
I think, or maybe like in terms of master students and 1 year programs, that maybe we really need to critically think about, okay, maybe we have to structurally change the way we give feedback, or enable change to happen, or make students aware of what can change and what are the timescales. So in terms of, like, let's say it's something, well, I don't know about room bookings, but let's say there is a possibility that next term, because in undergrad people take 0.5 modules, I'm not sure about the postgraduate thing, so maybe there is a possibility that there's like a number of things that can change on a term by term basis, like something like times. So maybe more needs to be done to communicate to students, okay, what are the different level of things that is realistic to change in your time? What are some things that is not realistic to change in your time, but we still want your input to help other students? Because I feel as if, like, we shouldn't shy away from, like, I've had an experience in my course where a teacher said we were going to be assessed one way. We were like, it's not really the vibe. We got our academic rep involved, and he was able to make that change, like, in a couple of weeks as well. So I think of course that's very unrealistic, because we're just grateful that the program coordinator, like, allowed it. But I mean, in terms of, there must be things that students still have autonomy and agency to change in that short time frame. So let's find those things and communicate to students that these are the things within the realm of feasibility that you can change in your time. Focus on this, but we also want your feedback on X, Y, and Z. But due to structural constraints, it's not possible for you to see the changes, but it's just as important. And then making students know again, like, what are changes that other people have done that you are now benefiting from. So hopefully to encourage a circular economy of feedback and improvement.
And building on that too, I mean, one thing I think that Changemakers does so well is they've built this huge research repository that actually, as a new scholar, you can go back and look at what's been done, so that you're not sort of redoing work someone else has already done for you. So I think that structure is something that could be taken to something like the class reps. So for example, at my undergrad university, at the end of every year, you were asked to write up a report of sort of the major pieces of feedback you'd been given and anything that had been actioned at, there they were called SSE meetings, but same concept, right, as the SSLC. And then those got passed along to whoever was elected as class rep next year. And what that did was help create this sort of mini research repository of work that had been done within your department and changes that had been made, or things that maybe were advocated for that couldn't be done at that point, that needed more feedback gathered on, right? Because otherwise, when you're a class rep, especially if you're a master's in a 1 year role, those projects get dropped until someone else raises it. So I think being able to create some continuity between these years and between these cohorts by building some kind of repository of work that's been done would be a good first step in overcoming some of those, I think, issues.
And it's how you build institutional knowledge as well, so knowing about the practices that you've tried and failed, and maybe learning from past experiences and continue moving forward. In terms of the lessons that you've learned from your experience participating in different instances of how to work with students' voices. What would you advise on the things that are working? Because we discussed a little bit about surveys, right? But you as a working in the student union, like what's the capacity that you have, or what actions do you take, and then how do you interact with change makers and the work that you're doing as well at the student panel, like the venues that you're opening, and how can that be like continue to be worked on, but thinking about the lessons from your experience.
I think for me a key thing, and I can't stress this enough, is like to meet students where they are, and like to hold it with dignity. That, for example, like, I might have preferred an in-person meeting of us going through X, Y, and Z, but maybe the student just wants a phone call, no agenda item, and to talk to me. And it's like, you just need to think about, you should be grateful for their time, grateful that they feel comfortable to be vulnerable about maybe certain things they didn't want to voice, and it's okay if it's not, you know, this, like in terms of like maybe in LSE there's a thing of like, you have, if when you're meeting with someone, agenda item, okay, you're booking a space on a resource book, and for everything to be so formalized. But there might be some students that are like, what, why do you have to book a room, or why do I have to RS, you know, all of that stuff. They might not really connect with that whole formalized system. So I think a key thing for me is like being able to meet students where they are. So if it's like a student who wants to communicate something to me on a phone call, like during like a, you know, during like a, you know, not it being scheduled, just saying, oh, can I pop you a message? Of course, in terms of like, there is well-being concerns as a person, that you need to have your boundaries, I think is important for staff. But I think we definitely need to think about what more can we do to make students feel comfortable with giving feedback back to us. I think a key thing for me is just doing that, whether that be phone calls with students, or maybe I'm telling them, okay, I'm free around this time, if you can just pop me a message when you're ready to talk, that will be fine. So I've kept that space, that structured space for them, but I've allowed them to come to me to let me know. Then I think another thing as well is like, anyone in a leader position or from an institution, you need to do the work to go out and talk to students, because there might be students who are like, oh, in terms of the power dynamic, they might not feel comfortable to talk to you. And of course you can't prevent a student from not wanting to engage, but it's like, you don't know that. So in terms of working in the realm of theoreticals, you need to do the work to go out to those students and to make sure that they feel comfortable, or if anything, that you're just they feel like you're accessible to them. So I think that's quite key. Well, that's been quite key for me.
Yeah. And I think building off of a lot of what you were saying, one key lesson I've taken away from both my Changemakers work and my work as a class rep is the importance of communication. Sort of quite carefully communicating to students what type of feedback we're looking for, how we're asking them to think or approach certain issues. And then again, being really clear with what's going to be done with their data, how is this being taken forward, and then making sure again that at the end of everything, you feedback about what's been done. And I think setting the expectations by making that process clear from the start is really important. And I think for my Changemakers work in particular, it helped me reach a lot more people, because I wasn't just sort of throwing a survey at them, but is actually, to the best of my ability, explaining why this survey and taking the time to fill it out and think critically could end up benefiting them and benefiting the institution. And
can you tell us a bit about the practicalities of like, okay, your output, let's say, was the report.
Mm-hmm.
Then you send it back to the participants, you have conversations, or is it just...
Yeah, I mean, for me, the way I did it, because my participation in the Changemaker survey in particular was anonymized, so it's not like I could necessarily find the exact students that participated in my work. So one thing I did was I went back to the communication channels that I initially used to recruit students, and I shared the report there. So places like, we had a big group chat for everyone within our department that was a master's student at the time. So I made sure the report got shared back into that group chat and said, you know, because I'd shared the initial call for research there, and just let people know, thank you for everyone who participated, this is the outcome, you know, this is my email, if you want to chat more, feel free to get in contact with me. And so that's sort of how I went about it. And left it up to students to see what they wanted to do with it, because you also, I think, don't want to force something back at someone either. So
yeah, totally. I think from my experience in the SEP, there's probably two key things. One, is increasing awareness of channels. I think that's super important. So just like from my personal experience, the SEP, as I knew I was coming to LSE, I was already familiar with the university generally, so I didn't need to kind of wrap my head around that. So I was able to, like, you know, I knew where to look on the website for opportunities. I'd already followed the Instagram page because I had it from undergrad, all that kind of stuff. So I was aware of these opportunities. And so coming into the university, I kind of already had my mindset on what I wanted to do here. Whereas I think if you're coming straight to LSE for the first time, particularly from a master's perspective, you're overwhelmed with so much information in the first 4 weeks, to be honest. You're thrown into so many opportunities. You're trying to get to grips with your accommodation, where you're living in London, getting to uni, your course programs, picking your modules, all of the additional stuff that comes with that I think, you know, our course director is great. He sent out emails about all these opportunities, which is really good. But I do think still there's an element of like people can just feel extremely overwhelmed with what to do. And so, you know, there are several people in my course who maybe didn't even read the email, who didn't even know that the student panel existed. And so I think there is something really big about increasing awareness of these channels. And then also the second thing is just for everyone to have an open mind. I think we can all have our own opinions, and I've gone into the SEP with my own opinions, but when we are doing, we are having discussions there, everyone's background and experience is so different. I've never met a more diverse group of people than at LSE, and so I think we can all learn something from others' experiences, and then also it helps to connect different thoughts that we all have, where you might not have necessarily thought about something, but hearing someone else talk about their situation has triggered something in your mind. And so I think just having an open mind and learning from everyone's experience is key.
I guess that's one of the challenges when you're trying to like make sense of the voices. And yeah, I don't know if you've thought about that, but how much do you aggregate information, and then how much you take, or how, again, going back to the practicalities of how do you make sure that the voices are heard, and then that you implement according to some kind of agreement. So do you think there are enough spaces where, yeah, students can have those conversations, because there's the student union representatives, where that's one of the voices that gets heard institutionally, but how do you make sense of the multitude of voices, and how do you channel that?
I feel like you can't make sense of it, but I feel like, don't worry, there is like an action of like, you just have to keep in mind of like, and this is a drawing on another practice, but in terms of like the difference between conflict resolution and conflict transformation, of like we're in this continuous cycle of like improving and changing, and it's like it's okay for there not to be this end goal or something, because society doesn't have an end goal. It's going to change and adapt, and as a university, we're a microcosm of society. So in terms of something I've seen in the student union is that like our practices and our business as usual, we have business as usual, it's always changing. We're taking things out and we're taking things in, and I think that shows in terms of an institution, you need to try your best to be flexible, or at least have an understanding of things might change. And then in relation to student voice, we have part-time officers that represent different protected, marginalised characteristics, and that has changed over the years in terms of we've changed it, and then in terms of response for students of what works best. So one key example is that we had 2 posts that for disability and then neurodivergent, and then feedback from students has been in terms of like identifying, you know, somebody might identify as both, or they found that separation a bit problematic. So something we did in response was to merge the 2 roles to make it more accessible for anyone who feels, oh, you know, I also identify as disabled, but also identify as neurodivergent, and to help in terms of, yeah, just students finding that role a bit more accessible to them, rather than thinking, oh, which one do I do, and am I not that one, or am I not this? So I think in terms of student voice, we need to take an element of it will probably change, and we probably have to react to things, but also we can enable things like change makers and the research that we have to take changes that are proactive, but also evidence driven.
Yeah, and I also think one thing I thought a lot as as a change maker was just how much a diversity of voices requires a diversity of solutions. So more than likely, you're going to have views that directly conflict with each other, and there's not going to be one singular policy that's going to fit every student. So we need different policies. And that can be as simple as something, for assessments when I was a class rep, I got some feedback that people loved the assessment methods. And I got other comments that people hated the assessment methods. So how do you deal with that, right? Yeah. Well, you add diversity, you allow for people to continue offering, some version of the assessment methods that are in place, but you could also trial alternatives, and you could give students the choice between the two of them. I think that's one way to do it. Now again, logistically, that's more work. But I think that's one way to sort of approach this issue of diverse and conflicting voices is actually, well, we don't just need one rule, maybe we need a bunch of rules, right?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think to your point, and also your point is really interesting, that I think there are so many different perspectives, but I think there will be some level of aggregation that is possible to identifying a key problem, which I do think will be common amongst different views, but it will just manifest in different ways, and therefore different solutions are required to meet the needs of different things. But I definitely think there is a way to channel different perspectives to make it actionable and usable.
And I guess having those spaces where you have time to share with other students as well, because then even your idea of what a good assessment is might change as well, or the things that you need to be done, the different solutions that you might agree or not, but just having those spaces for students, not again, you have the horizontal level and the vertical level, how you create those spaces for students to talk to each other, whether it's facilitated or by whoever is interested in doing that. And this would be the last question, and just to wrap up. Giving your the roles that you've taken, how have you concretely seen your voice heard through the different actions that you've taken at LSE?
Yeah, I can go first on this one as an example. So one of the topics that was discussed in the SCP was around the use of AI in assessments and what that's like. And they talked about how there are different, so you have these key meetings, and then you have further opportunities to develop those ideas more. And one of the further opportunities was around presenting the ideas to things, education forum or something like that, with different people across LSE, and I think, and then that then gets fed back in the next sub-panel, in the next meeting. So for me, that's a really clear feedback loop, and really actually quite tangible, because there's already a next action. You already know people are going to present at that meeting. I think there probably is an element of, okay, so what now? But in terms of that initial piece of feedback, I can say from the perspective of the SCP, I definitely feel like our voice is listened to, and it is fed back and spread in quite concrete ways.
I would say definitely, but I think there's also, bringing back to the first point about positionality, in terms of my role has definitely enabled me in terms of power mapping and institutional knowledge, and because I'm in a leadership role, I actually have resources to see the change that I want to. So I would say definitely yes, but I think there's an element of being critical. I'm in a position that affords me, I don't have any what would you say, gatekeepers. I've less gatekeepers before, in terms of, I want this event to happen, okay, I'm going to allocate budget because I want it to be done. So I think I've had less gatekeepers, and that's definitely helped. But I would say I feel as if my voice has been heard, and I feel like this role is, the role of a sabbatical officer, is very, very empowering for a student.
Yeah, I think for me, similarly, one of the reasons I feel like I know so much about the feedback loops being closed is because I've stayed at LSE, and so I'm still in contact and in communities that had sort of pre-existed when I was a student. But similarly, I think the feedback loop is clearly being acted on, because I've seen the feedback I've given been taken forward at different levels of the school, which is quite exciting. But I know that because of my position as a staff member and not my position as a student or an alumni. So I think it's really interesting to think about how do we, even after you've left LSE, people still care about this community and they care about what they've contributed to it. So how do we feed that back past your time as a student?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your time and for participating. Any final words, or have we said everything we needed?
I think we've said
Thank you
everything.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate my how grateful I am for your time and for reflecting on this topic, and because I've seen you in different instances, and it's something that you've been discussing and that is relevant for the institution as well, and trying to generate different like points of access as well to these discussions. So that's why we chose this format, because there were some conversations happening at the previous education forum. There are conversations happening at the student education panel. So if someone wants to listen to the brilliant ideas that you've been sharing and reflections, we thought this would be a good venue. So thank you very much, and that's it.